Hi, this is Tom Kemp. I'm the CEO of Centrify Corporation. Welcome to another Centrify Video Chalk Talk. And today's topic is using group policy to do Mac desktop lockdown. I'm joined today with David McNeely, our Director of Product Management. And this is one of many Chalk Talks that we have just on the Mac platform alone. And so we've done prior Chalk Talks talking about just our overall Mac support, as well as a two-part Chalk Talk on our smart card support. But this one is going to be very specific about using and leveraging group policy to lock down your Macs using the same administrative tools that you use to lock down your Windows environment. So I keep on talking about group policy as the means and mechanism for our solution to do desktop lockdown. Mm-hmm. For the people that may not be as familiar with group policy, can you just give a 20,000-foot overview of what group policy is?
Absolutely. So in its simplest form, group policy is really nothing more than the ability to centrally define registry settings for Windows machines. Given that a whole lot of the applications on a Windows machine nowadays use a registry as opposed to the older WinINI files, what we find is that that's where we store all the custom settings for those apps. And in order to centrally manage those, Microsoft came up with the group policy infrastructure as a way for us to describe those same settings, push them out via Active Directory's domain infrastructure, and have the machines pick up their policies and figure out what policies apply to the machine and enforce those.
Now, policies can also not only apply to the machine, but can also apply to users.
Yes, absolutely, and it depends on the kind of policy that you're setting. So machine settings are typically going to be like the configuration of the network, maybe the HTTP proxy settings, that kind of thing. Application settings are going to be typically done for the user, because there may be different settings for me than there are for you, let's say for Outlook, as an example. And so there's a different case for those to be defined. It depends on which method works best and what kind of policy it is.
Okay, so desktop lockdown seems to have a couple of applications. One application is just from a improving cost perspective from a help desk, because as I recall from when Microsoft first introduced group policy and this concept of desktop lockdown that they had, is that the help desk were getting calls from people like deleting icons off their main desktop, and so they delete the Internet Explorer icon, and so the help desk has to mess around. So obviously desktop lockdown can control the system from a configuration perspective, but it can also provide a security capability. Can you talk a little bit about desktop lockdown from a security perspective?
Right, so there's a lot of cases where you would want to lock down things that are in the control panel. Right, so we don't want the users changing a lot of the settings there. We don't want them changing the proxy settings, especially if we're trying to control internet access. That's a very common one, where we want to make sure that we're in control of what sites people can go to, or make sure they're not browsing bad sites, that kind of thing. And you would normally do that by setting up a proxy server and forcing all the browsers to go through the proxy server to get to the internet. Or maybe even setting up VPN settings and defining that centrally and pushing it out via group policy. So there's a lot of typical IT needs that we would want to set up and make consistent across all the machines in the environment. Plus, if I bring one in, I want it to conform to this policy. And then from a security point of view, we want to make sure that the user can't mess with it. They can't change things that we've set.
Or you can force them, for example, I assume that group policy, not only in the Windows, but with our technology in the Mac, you can force screensavers to go on and have the password, right?
Right, and again, if you're tying into an Active Directory environment and the user's Active Directory account allows him to get to anything and he walks away from his computer, we want the screensaver to come on.
So a CFO of a corporation would bring his Mac have his Mac, mm-hmm. and he goes away for a cup of coffee, and then it turns out he goes out to lunch. That's actually not a good thing from a security perspective or compliance perspective, I should say.
Right, we definitely want that's probably one of the most widely used group policies that we have, is the ability to lock the screensaver and require a password in order to unlock it. And as we mentioned in the smart card session, we can use the smart card to require the smart card to unlock that if that's the chosen method for authentication.
So desktop lockdown in a Mac environment is important not only to save money from an IT perspective, So to kind of give the right environment, so if people start trying to mess with things that can cause calls into the help desk, they can reduce. But it sounds like from a security, like you described, but also from a compliance perspective. So there's
right,
go ahead.
there's just going to expand on the Macintosh side. So there's a lot of these same security settings that we see on the Windows environment, that are controlled via control panel. On the Macintosh side, they're all in system preferences dialog boxes in that interface, and some of them are even in-user settable. In very common, the requiring the password to unlock the screensaver. And the ability to force the screensaver to come on is an end-user preference that typically is not centrally managed. Given that if I click the padlock on the bottom left corner and lock it, so that only an administrator can make changes, and let's assume that the user is not an administrator of their own machine, but the user still has the ability to turn that on and off. And with our software, we can override that and force the setting, regardless of what the user does with that little checkbox.
So how does this at a high level? So how do people use? Maybe this is something that you put on the whiteboard right here, but maybe describe and talk about, so how do people deploy using our software with our agent on the Mac to enable the desktop lockdown?
Sure. So the first is that we have an Active Directory infrastructure, and within this Active Directory infrastructure, there's going to be a set of domain controllers. And the easiest way to view this is it's like a replicated database across a lot of these machines. I put it into one domain controller, and it just propagates to the others. And there may be more than one domain, and we find in other environments that there may be multiple domains based on trust relationships. But in an Active Directory environment, on somebody's administrator console, they run the group policy management console, and that allows me to see all of the policies that get defined. And once I'm looking at a specific policy, and by specific policy we mean a policy that applies to a specific OU or a specific domain. So there's a policy that applies overall for the entire domain, and then there's one that applies to a specific domain, or inside here, let's just draw a square and call that an OU. It'll apply to the specific OU. And there's all kinds of granularity, but once I have this group policy object defined, I would then launch the group policy object editor as a way to edit that group policy. So inside the group policy object editor, we're going to see a couple of things. And at the highest level, there's machine policies and user policies. And underneath here, what we've done is added in Centrify settings. And I'll just leave that not expanded. And underneath, we also have underneath the user, we've got Centrify settings as well.
So how do people get the Centrify group policies into the GPMC?
It's actually very easy. On your Windows machine, you just simply install our administrative console, and that brings with it all of the additional policies. And underneath here, there's going to be quite a few different ones. So there's settings for Unix, there's settings for Linux, there's settings for the Centrify DC, as well as Mac OS 10.
And so these are, and what are group policies? How are they defined? I mean, I assume that there's stores. How are they defined, and where are they stored?
Right, so once I've edited this policy, that creates a group policy object. That group policy object gets stored in Active Directory inside my domain controller. Typically, it's put onto the sysvol volume, and the sysvol volume is replicated across all domain controllers within a domain. So now I've got a Macintosh over here that's going to take my direct control software, and once it has joined Active Directory, it's going to retrieve that GPO. So let's just represent that as an object in here.
Or multiple GPOs.
It very well could be multiple GPOs.
Yes.
And it'll retrieve that and put it into, we have a virtual registry on the machine that's part of direct control.
So much like Windows has a registry where the various variables are set to control how the machine operates, we've done something comparable.
Right, so over here we've got a virtual registry that is basically constructed in the file system. And underneath there you'll see an object for the machine, and for each user that logs on, since we're a multi-user system.
So when a user logs in, it also
we're
pulls the
going to pull
GPOs.
in the GPOs for each user.
Now, it's interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about the depth and breadth of the number of Mac-specific policies, because I know we were the first ones to have group policy for the Mac, and I believe we're close to like 200, group policies
Right.
overall.
In our newest release, we've got a little bit over 200 policies.
Wow. So
So in a Macintosh only environment, let's talk about that first, because that's sort of where we get a lot of the requirements and the capabilities. Most Mac administrators, if they were purely Macintosh, they would have set up another Mac OS X server, and they would have installed Workgroup Manager or used it, WGM, as a way to define their settings. Now, they store this in their own directory, open directory, and then the machines bind and pull it down. But there's a method to enforce policies down here. It's a subsystem called MCX. We simply need to define the settings and make sure it gets into the machine. And so there's quite a few different settings they have here and the ability to define them across a group of machines or individual machines. We have a little bit more flexibility over here on the Windows side, because I can apply it to an OU or a domain, or I can even filter for an entire forest across a group and use an Active Directory group as a way to define where does this policy that I've defined apply. But then we pull it across, and we're going to enforce the same kinds of things you could describe up here with Workgroup Manager. These are exposed in a Macintosh user interface format, and we'll bring that across and translate it into something that the Windows administrator understands. Because remember, a Windows admin already is familiar with using this because he's using it to set up his Windows settings. And that's just in the same dialog box. And basically all we're doing is enumerating all of the settings that I can control. We're copying a lot of them that have been exposed in Workgroup Manager and exposing them over here. And then we're using the Active Directory infrastructure as a way to propagate those
So
settings.
a lot of large organizations, probably 90-95% of their desktops are Windows, and maybe the other couple percent are Mac. So now they can have a single administrative tool to be able to, and basically using kind of the same technology to be able, they can leverage that to be able to provide the desktop lockdown to the Mac environment.
Absolutely right.
Okay, so there's not another interface or anything like that. It's all completely integrated.
It's all done purely over here on the Windows side. And what we're finding is that it's a lot easier for the IT manager to find and hire new people that understand how to manage Windows systems than it is to hire Macintosh-specific admins that know how to manage large populations of Macs.
So let's talk about some specific examples of group policies that we offer. One of which, and maybe talk a little bit more color commentary on this, is that probably from a security perspective, there's a big concern of someone coming up, putting a USB device and walking away with copying some data over or loading something on, etc. Can we address that?
Yes, in fact, Apple's MCX subsystem that we're controlling again has a lot of those kinds of controls in place in order to enable us to centrally control with the machine setting under Mac OS X the ability to control whether or not a user can access, which means read or write, to any removable devices. And that means CDs, DVDs, burners, because all Macs nowadays come with a DVD burner, USB thumb drives, external hard drives.
So we can block those either coming in or stuff being written to them. That's
they all
huge.
get mounted automatically, especially in secure environments. We can, if you turn on that policy and say that I cannot read, write, and I've logged onto the system, and I insert my thumb drive, it doesn't even mount. It never shows up on the desktop.
Wow. So I think especially the federal government, is going to absolutely love that, have that capability if they have any Macs. Okay, and then so that's an example from a security perspective. Talk a little bit more about the fact that there are some local. You mentioned earlier that there's some actual local preferences that, but we actually provide some policies that can actually override and control what the end user may set.
Right. So there's a lot of things that the user might want to define, like his, the requirement to turn on the screensaver or the ability to unlock that.
Yeah. And of course, corporate IT, that's end user may like that, but corporate IT, if the person works in accounting or something like that, may say, well, that's nice, but our corporate policy is
right. The screensaver must come on in 10 minutes or 15 minutes of inactivity, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
The other is a lot of the user experience and the user interface. Has a little bit more to do with which screensaver comes on, where the dock is located, which icons show up in the dock, which applications the user can execute. All of those things can be centrally controlled with group policy, so that we can, if we want to enforce a standard corporate look and feel across all the machines to ensure that everybody has, specific applications on their desktop, and that, if I walk in and sit down to a machine somewhere else, in a lobby or something, that I know exactly where to go find the things, and it's consistent across all the machines. There's ways to control that using group policy, just a matter of defining those policies for the applications.
Yeah, so we're not providing just 10 or 11 group policies. We're providing over 200 that do, any other specific examples that customers really
So another
like?
one that comes up quite often is, more than likely, this Macintosh is a portable machine. So Apple's made a lot of progress, and their MacBook Pros are extremely popular. And so one of the things we find as a common configuration is to set it up as a portable home directory user. Now that means that my home directory is stored here on this disk, but replicated out to a Windows server, so that I get, my home directory here is backed up essentially automatically behind the scenes. I never know. When I take my machine off the network, I'm still operating local. When I come back on the network, I'm still operating local, but in background he's synchronizing. So there's another problem here, which IT needs to control. Because inside here, remember, it's not just my documents, but it's my music, and it's my pictures, and it's my movies, and we certainly don't want this stuff I've got 30 gigs of music on my machine, and if I take pictures, I download, and where does it go? It goes to pictures. This stuff we don't want to traverse the network. We really just want documents. And so there's group policies over there to control that and say, let's exclude this and exclude that and exclude that, only backup documents.
That's cool.
So that we make sure that that's enforced.
And it sounds like, just maybe going back, it sounds like we do offer group policies that you don't get with the Workgroup Manager. So we go over and beyond what that offers.
Right. There's a few that we offer on top of that, and we've gone beyond, especially in the case of smart card login, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
But the other thing is flexibility of the tool. So the Group Policy Object Editor and the Group Policy Management Console is something that a lot of the Windows admins understand, right? I can apply a policy to a user or a machine, and then I can also apply the policy to, as we were saying earlier, to a specific domain, specific OU, or at a higher level and filter on a group. And that applies to both the machine policies and the user policies.
Okay.
But then there's another situation we run across quite often, and usually this is in the education community, where the user moves and logs on to different computers based on the lab that he needs to go into, a math lab or the science lab, and things like that. And so in that case, remember these things like the doc, and where does the doc show up on screen, and the applications that are visible to me as a user might be different in the math department than they are in the science department. And so, but that's a user policy. So the way we can address that with group policy is to use loopback processing.
Okay.
And loopback processing simply means I can take a user policy here and apply it to the machine. It's not activated until the user logs on. But when the user logs on to this machine, based on the fact that it's in the math department, I get the math settings for the user. But if I log on to another machine in the science department, I'm going to get the science department user settings. So it's not like those settings follow me around. It's like those settings are user settings, but they're specific to where the machine is physically located. So if your company decided you wanted to have, let's say, kiosk machines in the lobby of all the buildings that you had, and you wanted to make sure there was a common experience for the kiosk, that's a perfect example for a user policy that's applied to a machine, because the machine has specific purposes. Or in the high security federal environment, you might want to have specific user settings based on the machine is in a high security environment versus a low security environment. Because if you go back and look at some of the requirements in the government space, a lot of them are based on the NIST Standards. For 800-53 is a specific document that talks about it. But that's defined, and there's 3 different categorizations they put their machines into: low, medium, and high security. And so if it's a low security system, sometimes a lot of these policies are not necessary. As far as fine-grained authorization or audit capabilities are not required on low security systems. But medium and high security systems require increasing levels of security and audit. And it's on the high security systems where we might want to define some of these user settings and apply it to those machines differently than we do the low security systems.
That sounds familiar. One of our customers is looking at the Center for Internet Security, some guidelines and standards for the Mac, and they're literally just using our group policies to mapping our group policy to the actual standards themselves. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Right. So the CIS standards are actually implementations of and recommended configurations for high security, but they're all actually based on the NIST standards.
Okay.
So if we chase this up high enough, FSMA is where a lot of this started. And FSMA defines the fact that OMB has responsibility for enforcing the requirements for security. And they said, well, since we're politicians, we don't really know too much about the security standards. Let's get the guys that really know. And they contracted with NIST to define the standards. So NIST 853 defines what the requirement is, but it didn't say how to accomplish. So CIS is describing in specific documents how to accomplish it.
And commercial organizations are also leveraging CIS as well as industry best practice.
Right.
So from time to time, I've heard this thing called a P-list, okay? So what is a P-list and how does it relate to our capabilities here?
Right, so the easiest way to think about a P-list from a Windows perspective is nothing more than a registry file for that specific application.
Okay.
So it's basically, it's an XML constructed file, but it's a little more analogous to the older INI style files that we used to have for applications.
Okay.
But so let's say that I had taken a Macintosh and I had installed Office 2008 or some Adobe products, and how would you centrally manage and control the configuration settings for those applications? Would normally be to take a machine, install it, change all the settings that you want, and it creates these P-list files in the preferences on that particular machine. The way to get a whole bunch of machines to perform and behave exactly alike is to take that P-list file and bring it up into group policy and centrally push it out.
Okay.
And so we've got a new group policy that allows me to basically take any third-party application that supports Plist, do exactly that, set it up and make it look exactly the way I want all the users' applications to look, and grab the Plist file and go
and do
distribute it via group policy.
Basically, bulk group policy equals bulk configuration. And so this
bulk
is
distribution, bulk update of the config file like that.
Oh, that's cool. And then, from a that maybe ties in with the whole element of customization. I assume that people could add their own group policies and do additional lockdown of the desktop using our capabilities, probably using Plist. Is there other ways to customize?
Well, right. We already mentioned the Plist capability, but that leverages a fundamental capability of direct control, which is the ability to distribute a file.
The file copy, yeah.
A file could be anything. It could be an executable file, it could be a batch file, it could be a script. And that's one way to, let's say, distribute to login scripts or to execute those centrally. So there's a lot of capabilities within group policy. The other is that we did build this to be extensible. So the way that we execute and pull out this virtual registry and go affect files inside the file system is something that anybody could go create. In fact, we have several customers that do that today. They use our ability to go figure out what policies apply to this computer. You simply have to define more settings over there on the group policy object editor side. That's just constructing XML to describe the settings. What settings do I need to expose in user interface? They get set, pushed across to a virtual registry, and we have a Perl mechanism to go read this stuff and then go take some action. And taking action could be edit a file or create a new file and then go launch an executable. And again, it's all run securely as root. So there's any number of things that you could use that for.
That's great. So it sounds like we've talked about our detailed smart. So we offer a lot on the Mac environment. I mean, clearly we offer the best authentication, single sign-on, Active Directory client into the Mac environment that supports 150 other flavors. But you've talked about today the group policy and the fact that we have over 200 group policies that can do the bulk configuration and the Mac smart card support. But we also work with other vendors in this thing called Enterprise Desktop Alliance. Maybe why don't you talk a little bit about the Enterprise Desktop Alliance and how we work with some of the other vendors to provide Mac management.
Right, so we got started with the Enterprise Desktop Alliance because as we were talking to a lot of customers that were mostly Windows-centric shops, and they wanted to know, so my VP just brought in this new Macintosh, how do I manage it? Or we've got this department over here and we want to bring them into the standard setting within my environment. There's quite a few other things in addition to just user authentication, security configuration, lockdown that we do with direct control that needed to be addressed. Like How do you do software inventory management, software updates of applications, that kind of thing. And that more closely ties into Microsoft's SMS. And so we found this company, LandRev, that has that kind of capability to centrally manage via Windows console or Macintosh console and manage the software inventory, push files out, and integrate with Microsoft's SMS on the inventory management side. And so we brought them into this EDA along with Group Logic that helps with how does this machine gain access to that file server. What I described earlier, I didn't talk about the protocols, but that could either be SMB, which is pretty good for Macintoshes, but there's some limitations. Given that Macintosh users are used to typing file names that have illegal characters from a Windows point of view. I can put a question mark inside a file name or the colon, things that a Windows machine just refuses to recognize. And they have an AFP server that runs on Windows so that this share looks like an Apple server share back to the Macintosh client. And so that's the easiest and most secure way to get a Macintosh to tie into a Windows file server. And then we brought in parallels because there was a need to ensure that if I am running a Macintosh or want to offer Macintosh as an alternative to the Windows platform within my environment and have it as an approved desktop platform. But I run into an application that requires me to run an Office on the XP type application, like let's say Microsoft Project or Visio. The only way for a Macintosh user to do that is to basically run XP on his Macintosh. Now with Parallels, you can do that, and I can actually, if I receive an attachment from you, and it's got a Visio file or a Microsoft Project file, I simply double click, and it's going to launch Visio. And to me as a user, it looks like it just launched Visio running on an XP, but I'm still on my Macintosh.
Yep.
I get a seamless experience there. And so we've got one other vendor that does backup capabilities, a Tempo.
Tempo, yeah.
Because, again, it's a desktop and it's got critical information on it. It needs to be backed up.
So it sounds like, so not only do we offer this great technology from the authentication, access control, group policy, as well as the smart card support, but we work closely with these other vendors as part of the Enterprise Desktop Alliance to give customers the best Mac management capability from a Windows perspective. So is there anything else you want to add, or should I just wrap it up?
I think that's about it. Other than
another great
we are
job.
running across quite a few customers that are starting to look at Unix, Linux in the same way that they do the Macintosh, and we are doing quite a bit of work there to enable the same kind of desktop lockdown on these other platforms.
Absolutely, and that's, we're going to be talking about that pretty soon. So, well, thank you very much for checking out another video Chalk Talk. So, again, in terms of related topics to this one on locking down Mac desktops using GP, we have a separate Chalk Talk about the group policy architecture that covers it in a lot more detail. Paul Moore and I did that. Or you can just go to a Chalk Talk that talks just at a high level about the authentication capabilities that we offer on the Mac. David and I did that Chalk Talk. We have a two-parter on the smart card support, which is always good to check out if you have or are looking to use smart cards in the Mac environment. And of course, you can always visit enterprisedeskopalliance.com to see how we work with our partners to provide the most robust set of solutions to manage the Mac from a Windows perspective. So thank you very much for checking out another video Chalk Talk, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, bye.